Good morning, guys. Hey, this morning we're going to continue the series on that Pastor Mike started teaching. It was on and sharing about on attractive faith. And when he left, he gave me a topic that he wanted me to speak on. And I won't lie to you, I'm quite challenged to speak on this because he wanted me to talk about sharing your faith or evangelism. And I'm going to tell you just up front why I have trouble with this. Because I'm like most people, the way that it works for me is the right way. That's just it. And so what I want to share with you today is some things that I hope are helpful. And I'm going to do my best to be as neutral as possible. But I am going to tell you that there is a certain way that works for me. But I want to use that way as an example, if you would. You know, St. Francis of Assisi said this, and he was someone who lived hundreds of years ago, but he said, preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. And when I was going through and growing up in church, and when I went to school to get my training to be a pastor, and for every class I ever went to, this saying was used over and over again. And it was always emphasizing one thing. Rarely was it explained what it means to preach the gospel at all times, but it was always said, you got to use words. And at that time, we would often have a discussion about how we can hop into a van and go to a mall and pass out tracts, or we can go someplace where there's a lot of people. It might be in a football game or something like that. For instance, it would be like a BSU game, and we'd walk around, and people who were there to see a football game would suddenly get introduced to other stuff. Oh, this is so nice, because now I have so many examples I can share. Oh, well, okay. All right. So, in that process, I realized something is that I felt very much like if I was not willing to get in that van and go to wherever it was we were going to do exactly as I was being told, that I was somehow being disobedient to what God was doing. And this is what I wanted to share with you, because as I was looking and exploring, and I think I wanted to communicate kind of what I've seen, because if I were just talking to you from my own head, okay? If Jesus was on earth today, I would be following him, and he would be sharing the good news with people a certain way. And that's really no different than how it was when the disciples were walking the earth. Because if you read through the Gospels, you're going to find a point where the disciples are walking around and they find some people sharing about Jesus on a street corner, and they're quite disturbed. And they're disturbed because they're not doing it the right way. And so, put it this way, if Jesus was on earth today, him and I would probably be at the mall, because that's where everybody goes. And if we were at the mall, this is what we would run into. And I'm going to ask, would you play that video of the mall?
All right, this is Eddie. I got raised behind the scenes camera, and it's Saturday, it's my day off, and today we are hanging out at the mall. My church cares a lot about evangelism, and so we have an evangelism outreach at our local mall. Our church has made the decision to set aside some of its budget for tracts. So what we do is we go to the local mall, we set up a table, and then some of our members, this here is Clint, he's one of the members of our church. He's actually been through the Ambassadors Academy. All right, this is Eddie. I got raised behind the scenes camera, and it's Saturday, it's my day off, and today we are hanging out at the mall. My church cares a lot about evangelism, and so we have an evangelism outreach at our local mall. Our church has made the decision to set aside some of its budget for tracts. So what we do is we go to the local mall, we set up a table, and then some of our members, this here is Clint, he's one of the members of our church. He's actually been through the Ambassadors Academy. And what we do is we go out to the local mall, set out this table, and strike up conversations with people passing by. It's really easy to do. In fact, I think this is one of the easiest ways to get into evangelism conversations with people. People are curious, they come up to the table, they see what we got, we show them the tracts, we tell them everything's free, and it's really easy to get into conversations, and so that's what Clint's doing right now. So this is my friend Dojo. Dojo is on our evangelism team. Dojo has also been through the Ambassadors Academy. So Dojo, how does one go about getting a mall table to do evangelism like this?
Well, it's simply easy because basically every mall is required by law to have a public access table for anyone who wishes to utilize the mall as a venue to either promote something for as long as non-profit.
So if someone wants to see if they could set up a mall table in their city, what should they do?
They should just ask for where the administrator's office is and just inquire. And I bet they will be able to give them some information about where to set up the mall or what time. And usually they'll be very helpful in terms of what day you want to have the public access table and just set it up. Usually they give us every week access. Sometimes it's every other week, depends on the mall management.
All right, Dojo, thanks a lot.
Okay, the good news is I've rented 3 vans. And it's so easy that I already have a table waiting for us. Okay, if I saw that, I just want you to know I am a follower, I'm a believer. I have not lived a perfect life, but I've done my best to live a life for Jesus, but I would avoid that table with everything I am. And I avoided that table with everything that I was when I was even in a point of confusion in my life. Now, am I saying the table's wrong? Oh, no. There are people who love that table, and they would be there in a heartbeat. But I want to share with you how I experienced that table. Is that all right? 1 second. Could you roll that video? Because, and I'm going to warn you, it's very, very graphic.
We are Borg. You will be assimilated.
I am Locutus of Borg. Resistance is futile. Your life, as it has been, is over. From this time forward, you will service us.
You will be assimilated.
Resistance is futile.
We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile.
Resistance is futile. And I've been cornered by people at the table before, and I can tell you, resistance is futile. Now, again, I'm not against the table. I think that Clint and Dojo, I think they're great. I think that's awesome that they do what they do. And I honestly do believe there are people who've had great experiences at that table. But what I also want to talk about today is really where is the heart of what we're doing. Because the truth is if I present to you how I share my faith, and just remember, evangelism is sharing the good news about Jesus to everybody. And if I shared with you how I prefer to share good news, you might think, well, jeez, that's not going to work. Well, it worked for me. And some might be saying, well, I really was hoping you had the van here because I'm ready to go hit the table. And there's just so many ways that we can share what's happening in our lives and so many processes we could use. But I fear so much that in my own life, there was a point where I was more concerned about the how than the why. I was more concerned about the process than what it is I really should be concerned about. It was almost like if I was a disciple with Jesus, I saw the table and saw that. Jesus, we've been traveling everywhere. We heal and feed and do all of these things. We don't do no tracks at a table. And Jesus' response to the disciple was pretty simple. It is, hey, what's it to you? They're glorifying my name and they're doing it. Just let them do it because they're pointing people to me, is what Jesus said. But I want to take a few moments and do this. Because oftentimes it seems like in church culture and so forth, there's a prevailing way that is taught, a prevailing idea. And you do feel like you have to go that route or you're insane. For instance, when I have shared with folks that use the table and said, you know what, this is just not for me. Are you crazy? This is the easiest way to do this. Not insane. If you love working at a table with tracks, you're not insane either. And in fact, as we go through this, you're going to find that just about any way that you share your story, any way that you share about what Christ has done in your life, there's a good chance someone's going to think you're insane when you're not. But the whole topic of evangelism shouldn't be scary for us. It shouldn't feel like something like assimilation where I've got to conform. It should feel like a unique and very good opportunity to share the good news about what Jesus is doing in your life and how that affects the world around us. And so we want to take a few moments to look at that today, sharing the good news and what that looks like. Paul was probably one of the best at it. Of course, Jesus was, but Paul shared all of the time his faith with others. And he did it a multitude of different ways. He did it with singing. He did it with while he was in prison, while he was shipwrecked. He was always sharing. But I want you to go back and remember the saying that we're using today, and that is this, is that St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. I think in our American culture, we are like this. Use words, and when necessary, preach the gospel. I think that's pretty much how we live. Because I'm guilty of having the words, but not the life. And if we're honest in this room, and this is going to be borderline gossipy, you're sitting in your mind and you know people who have the words and not the life. Because the good news isn't always what we say, but it has something more to it. If you want to follow, I'm just going to read it because it's written out here. This is chapter 26 of Acts. Paul's been arrested and he's going before the king, King Agrippa. And this is how that whole conversation went. Then King Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against the accusation of the Jews." That he wasn't a Jew. And especially so because you are acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. The Jews all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child. From the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem, they have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I've lived as a Pharisee. For those of you who don't know, a Pharisee was someone who followed the rules without fail. And they knew him, followed him, and the success of their relationship with God was based on how well they followed those rules. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I am on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God the day and night. O king, it is because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? That's usually a sticky point, isn't it? Jesus risen from the dead? I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the saints in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blasphemy. In my obsession against them, I even went to foreign cities to persecute them. On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. About noon, as I was riding on the road, I saw a light from heaven and saying, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, "Saul, Saul," that's English, by the way, "why do you persecute me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads." Then I asked, "Where are you, Lord?" Or who are you? "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting," the Lord replied. "Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen of me, and I will show you. I will rescue you from your own people, from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven, first to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and in all Judea, and to the Gentiles also. I preached that they should repent and turn to God and prove their repentance by their deeds. That is why the Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But I have had God's help to this very day. And so I stand here and testify to the small and great alike. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that Christ would suffer and as the first to rise from the dead would proclaim light to his own people and to the Gentiles. And at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You are out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane." "I am not insane, most excellent Festus," Paul replied. "What I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it is not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Then Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a follower of Christ? And Paul replied, short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, a follower of Christ, without these chains. You know, as you hear all of that, you can see a pretty dramatic setting of what's happening and what Paul is going through. And literally, Paul faced so many hardships, is not even the right word, as he was a follower of Christ. But the amazing transformation that he went through can't be denied. This is what you need to know about that story. Is it the words that were absolutely captivating the people, or was it something else that was behind those words that absolutely affected everybody that was sitting in that courtroom that day? I'm going to suggest it was something behind those words. Because think of it this way. What if it had been somebody else in that room who said the exact same words at the exact same time with the exact same skill? Would it have had the same impact on the lives of others? If you put Dennis Rodman in this room saying those things, how powerful is that? Not very powerful at all. If you put Billy Graham in that room saying these things, that has some more power, doesn't it? It certainly does. When you put Paul in that room saying those things, I'll tell you why it was powerful, because everybody in that room knew what he said was true. They knew that this Paul was Saul. He was a persecutor. He was chasing down Christians. He was doing all he could to stop this crazy movement. We don't know what happened, but it is true, because something on that road to Damascus changed him forever. And he's now Paul, who is now the follower of the one he used to seek out, persecute, vote against. That's amazing. Well, hold on one second, though. Because I spent a lot of time growing up in the church, and I always wished that I had a better testimony. I don't know if you've been there and you've grown up in the church, because there was always somebody that escaped death or gunshots or whatever else. For me, I just grew up in a small town and survived a four-wheeler rollover. So just a scratch. I had tread marks across my belly. So I didn't even see Jesus that day. So anyways, what I'm saying is I felt like it was so boring. The power doesn't exist in this story because Paul's transformation was so great. It exists because it's so authentic. It's so authentic. They saw it. They knew it. Everybody in that courtroom knew who Paul was. He was on display to them his whole life. And he took the words of St. Francis of Assisi and understood it. Preached the gospel. He did. And when necessary, use words. He did. And from Paul, there's just 5 things I want to go over real quick. And it really shows in what Paul did in chapter 26 and how he presented it and what was important to him. The first thing is this, is more than anything to Paul, aside from his following of Christ, people mattered more than anything. People just mattered. I'm going to confess to you, there's been points in my life where it was confusing to me. In all of my training to become a pastor, there was times where we went to rooms and conventions and seminars where we had contests. It's just like real estate business. Let's make some cold calls and see if we can get some listings. Let's make some cold calls and see if we can get some people saved. You know what? If God used that, I think that's great. But I'm here to tell you, it's about as successful as cold calls in real estate. I call up people on the phone. I love Seinfeld's response to that was, well, I'm in the middle of dinner. Well, great. Do you know Jesus? How about I call you back tonight at 7 and we'll talk about it, but I'll be home and I'm off work. Exactly. You know what I'm talking about? So we would have these contests, load up in a van and come back, and everybody would sit around the table. So I talked to so-and-so. We prayed this prayer. I showed him my bracelet. I gave him a WWJD bracelet too. And then I also took him through the throne, the cross, the bridges, the gap. And before you know it, we prayed the prayer of salvation. I want you to know something right now. I'm not trying to be overly sarcastic and say these things are horrible. But what I am telling you is we get it backwards. There is so often a point in the church where we don't care about people anymore. We say we do, we believe we do, and we say we do because I want to get them saved. I want you to know something. If you care more about saving this person or making sure you get through a process with them than hearing their story and where they're at and the life they're living and understanding who they are, this is no longer preaching the gospel. This is now doing something completely different that mirrors more American business structures than it does the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because the gospel of Jesus Christ was pretty simple. He said, go into all the world, share the good news, bring hope to those who are hopeless, feed those who are hungry, bring help to those who are needy, and share tracts every chance you get. Again, nothing against tracts, but I know that when you're a waitress, you just love a tract instead of a tip, don't you? Guys, sometimes we get it so backwards. People matter. I want you to know something. People matter so much that Jesus was willing to die for people that didn't even like him. People matter so much that it was more important to him to take care of people than about anything else. In fact, we often lose sight of the people that drove Jesus the most nuts were the Pharisees. And they had tracts. And again, nothing wrong with tracts. Sometimes we get it backwards. So I want you to think about how much people matter. People out there that are not here this morning, some of them are just skipping, and I'll let Pastor Mike know. Okay? But there are people out there that don't go to church. In fact, almost 80% of Boise doesn't go to church. There are so many seats open today. I mean, we have a stadium that'll seat 38,000 and no one's there this morning. There are more people out there that think you and I need saved than they do. When I was a youth pastor in Anchorage, Alaska, my next door neighbor, John, we got to know him. And he stopped me one day. And he said to me, because I was walking, I had the blessing of my house being right by the church. And if you've ever been a pastor, you know that's not a blessing. And I think the senior pastor planned that because it worked well for him. And so I'm joking, okay, guys? The senior pastor was a great guy, but I did live next to the church. So I would walk up to the church every day, and we got to know John. And John made it clear when we first got to know him, he's not interested in this Jesus thing, okay? But we still got to know him. And finally, after living next to him for 2 years, on a Wednesday night, no, it was actually a Tuesday night because I was going to a board meeting because churches meet a lot. And I was walking up to the board meeting after I'd already been there most of the day taking care of stuff. And John looked at me and said, "Where are you going, Chris?" I said, "I'm going up to the church." He says, "Really?" And we got to talking, and somehow the conversation got to the point of what happens up there. And so I said, well, these things happen, so on and so forth. And we talked for a couple minutes about that. And one time I just said, why don't you come up and join us sometime? It just seemed natural and right to say. You know what his response was? "Oh, no. I see how often you go up there, and I want none of that." Because he saw, I'm going to lose my life because you have to be up there all the time. Meetings, this and that. And he was convinced that I was crazy and that I needed to have a life. You know, there's maybe some truth to that in my life at that point, is I needed to have more of a family focus instead of a 5-hour board meeting focus. Because it was amazing how little we get done in 5 hours. Again, pastors understand that. But I want you to know this. I'm not advocating some form of cheap grace where you're so on the other side that you just let people do and be whatever they want. No, I'm only suggesting one thing. The way you treat people is more about preaching the gospel than the words you say sometimes. And the way you treat people, think about people, is what's going to give you the opportunity to use words when necessary and have it be powerful, just like it was powerful for Paul. I didn't realize that I kind of understood this because this was completely by accident, and I only share this story to let you know that I've probably failed more than I've succeeded. But there was one point in my life where I was a builder at the time, while I was a pastor, and there was a gentleman named Johnny. And unfortunately, Johnny just passed away, and it was very sad. But Johnny gave me some feedback once that really was more for me than I realized. He was going to the church that we were at that time, and I met him because as I was building, he was a flat worker. He did concrete. He was really good at it. And he was also very crass. Cussed a lot. My virgin ears, oh, they were hurting. He shared stories that, frankly, I don't know that I needed to hear. Purposely set out to try to make me uncomfortable. No one's had that occasion, I'm sure. Okay? Those things were happening, and somehow I made it through that. I don't profess to know, because 2 years into our relationship, about 2.5 after one Sunday morning when he just showed up at our church, he walked up to me and he says, Chris, I want you to know something. I've known a lot of people in the church. I grew up in Catholic school. That's got to be tough. And he told me about it. He just went down the line. I've been all of these places, and I've always been looked at this way. Because Johnny didn't dress like everybody else. Johnny didn't do things like everybody else. And in fact, if Johnny showed up in most churches in Boise, he wouldn't even fit. And he looked at me and says, Chris, you've known me in my lowest of lows, and you've known me when I've been doing my best. And he said this, he said, you've always treated me the same. Truthfully, I was floored because I didn't even realize I'd done that. And then I said, thank you, God, that somehow I got that right. But now I know what I need to know. I want to share with you. The only reason there was any type of word power in Johnny's life from me was because of the way he was treated. And that not depend on me. All of us have that opportunity. And so there was Paul standing before the king. Both of them had so much in common. And before Paul said anything about anything, he looked at them all and said, I know you. You know me. You know where we've been. You know what we've go through. You know you've watched me. And every person in that room knew that Paul was coming from a place of real humility. Seriously, you know me. Now, don't get me wrong. Was Paul a pushover? By no means. But he was very clear that what was most important to him in that room that day was that everybody knew he cared. Everybody knew that he was aware of where they were at. And then there was Paul who said in 1 Corinthians, remember 1 Corinthians 9, I've become all things to all people, that some might be saved. What does that mean? Does that mean he's a pushover? It means no. It's very interesting because if you've talked to missionaries, this is a sidetrack, but I've talked to missionaries that are in Thailand. They said the problem with American missionaries in Thailand is they're trying to create American followers in Thailand. And in reality, Paul went to Thailand and brought Jesus to Thailand. Paul went to Boise and brought Jesus to Boise. Paul went to Baker, Oregon, which is, no one's from Baker but me, right? Which is backwards. And he brought Jesus to Baker. Because he never went and said, you're going to be like me. For him, it was really about being like Jesus. And it started with realizing that people matter. The other thing about Paul is you realize you've got to be real. Paul was you could say very fortunate. He really was shipwrecked. He'd been caned, stoned, almost dead. He'd been imprisoned. He'd been freed. Paul had all of those stories that you and I probably don't have because I haven't been caned yet. I haven't been imprisoned yet. I haven't been freed from jail miraculously. I haven't been shipwrecked and been at sea for 3 days. I don't even know that I want to try that. I don't even know I want to try a lot of what Paul tried. But what I do know about Paul is this, is when he shared his story with whoever it might be, he shared it authentically. He didn't create things that did not happen. He didn't try to make it sound better than it was. He was 100% real. He didn't try to hide the fact that he used to be a really nasty guy. Sometimes that's tempting, isn't it? I'm going to just avoid the bad parts and jump to the good. Paul didn't. Paul was always 100%, this is it. Also, Paul was not afraid or intimidated, but just shared it without apology. And Paul was often called insane. And I can see that. A bright light, brighter than the sun, blinding you, that's crazy, Paul. Was Paul's response? Well, maybe it didn't happen. No, that happened. And he knew and he was unashamed about it. So what I'm going to suggest to you is this. Sometimes I think in the church or followers of Christ, we feel like we've got to make a story better than it really is, or sometimes leave parts out that really should be there, whatever it might be. And maybe you have an idea in your own mind of what we're talking about. I want to encourage you to be real. This morning, if you're struggling with this whole thing, I want you to know this. If you're struggling with whether you want to follow Jesus or not, Jesus is not afraid of that struggle. Just man is. Jesus is embracing that struggle. He's saying to you, if you're really struggling, let's do this. Let's go. It's man who's afraid of it. If you're not even sure what you want to do this morning, man, be real about it. Because you're not here on accident. You're here because somewhere you're expecting there's something real going on. You just don't show up at church because we pass out cheese. You show up at church because you're really hopeful and believing there's got to be something. So be real about where you're at in that journey, because there is somebody else who needs to hear exactly what you have to say. And that's exactly what Paul would do. Because I want you to know something about Jesus. He's very reasonable. And I want you to know something about following Jesus. It's pretty reasonable to consider that if God is God, he could rise from the dead, isn't it? It's pretty reasonable to think that if God is God, he could still be active and present in the world and just do it however he wants. True? Because if that's not true, then we're all in trouble. It's a very reasonable thing, and don't be afraid to keep it that way. It's actually incredibly reasonable. I actually was a philosophy major, so you're going to have to excuse me for 1 second. And what really always was troubling to me was how much more reasonable things are when you look at them through the eyes of a creator, of God, of Jesus, a Savior. And yet, we often find more reason in a process that would be like smashing a watch and believing that if we shake it long enough, it's going to magically come back together. There's so much reason that we're dealing with, and there's so much that's not unreasonable. Don't be afraid to share what you're going through, because anyone who's honest is going to receive that story. And they may say you're insane, but on the inside, I'm guaranteeing you, they're just wanting to avoid dealing with what you're dealing with. The other thing is, know what makes your story powerful. The before and after, just as we shared about, Paul talked about where he was and where he's now at. And it worked for Paul for the reason that we've already discussed, is because it was real. It was valid. His story was on display. The good news is that what Paul said with his mouth when it was necessary matched exactly how he lived his life in front of everybody. I'm convinced Paul made mistakes, but how he dealt with those mistakes reflected how Paul was as a follower of Christ. I'm convinced that Paul maybe tripped over, became a Peter, talked when he shouldn't have, but how he dealt with that was a reflection of Christ. I'm not saying Paul was perfect. What I am saying is this, is how Paul dealt with all matters in life matched up with the Jesus he claimed to follow very well. Very well. And if there's anything that I believe Billy Graham was right about, was What troubles the world today is to see a follower of Christ who says one thing with their mouth and does a completely different thing with their life. Okay, I'm not talking about the Borg, do you need to be assimilated? What did Jesus do? He loved people. He loved people. He took care of people. He was not ashamed to share. He was not ashamed. He was not fearful. He went where people needed help. He didn't spend a lot of time avoiding people who needed help. He went where he was needed. And he reached out to those who were being ignored. Man, that's the good news. You know that's the good news? Because if the good news is we've got the magic formula, which again, there is a formula look to it. But the good news is we know a God that cares. We know a God that reaches. We know a God that touches. We know a God that heals. We know a God that absolutely can bring peace to situations that we don't even understand. We know a God that absolutely can change the course of a life. The reason those words don't have power is because there's not the lives to back it up. But Paul was an example of that. I know that when I was in Alaska, Franklin Graham came to Alaska, and nobody knew Franklin Graham. But he got up, and there was thousands of people in this arena, and he shared a message, and everybody went to the front. I mean, it was packed. And in fact, I was kind of disappointed, and I mean this somewhat facetiously, but I was expecting there to be a glow or something in the room, angels in the rafters, because it was just like crazy how many people were walking up. But what happened afterward, I've never forgotten, is because there was a gentleman who showed up, got on the church bus, went to hear Franklin Graham speak, walked down to the altar, met with somebody that was there to talk with him, got a Bible, walked back, sat down, and then we went back out and got on the bus. And this is all he said to me is, "Whew, got that taken care of." We never saw him again. Consider this. Don't know what happened to that gentleman, but we never saw him again. If the life never matches the words, there's never going to be any power in that. Because what makes words powerful is what's behind it. Because the truth is if an electrician started talking to me about dentistry, I'm not listening. If someone broke tells me how to get rich, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just telling. Don't you understand? You know what I'm saying? If someone tells me how to be a follower, but yet there's no evidence of it, I can hear all the best words in the world, but the power in those words is in the proof that's behind it. And that's what Paul had. I love Dave Ramsey. Sometimes I hate him. Okay, we're almost done, guys, but I got to tell you, I had this great privilege of hearing him speak live. I've always seen him on the videos, and sometimes it drives me nuts, but if you've not been through Financial Peace, I'm going to guarantee you that there's a man teaching it that his life backs up what he's teaching, and it will change your financial life. It did ours, and we only half followed it. So, just keeping it real. I wish I had followed all of it. Maybe at some point we will. He got up in front of it. He came and spoke to our real estate company, which was amazing, and I was amazed that our company would have him come because he's unashamed about who he follows, and he's a Jesus follower. He's unashamed about sharing Bible verses in the middle of a business speech, but he shared something so important about what is the power behind anything. And he's in the financial business. He wants to help people get out of debt. He wants to help them get financially right. But more than anything, to his 84 employees, he wants to be an example of what it means to be a follower of Christ. Or he said in the room, to be someone who will do the right thing. So he believes in teachable moments. His 12-year-old son and him were walking up to a picnic that they were having. It was a appreciation picnic for all of his employees and their families. They were there. They were having a barbecue, jumpers. They had just tons of fun stuff, and they were planning on spending the whole day just having fun on a Saturday. But as he was walking up, because he got there a little bit late because he had to fly in and so forth, his 12-year-old son was with him, and then he was up on the sidewalk before he was going down to where everybody was at. And he stopped and said, wait a minute, right there, son. And I guess his son said, oh no, a teachable moment? Yes, sir. And he said, look at that down there. What do you see? And the son says, well, Dad, I see a bunch of people. I see barbecuing. I see people talking, having fun. I see a bunch of people down there who are just having a good time. Why does this even matter? And Dave looked at his son and said, I'm going to tell you what I see. I see 84 families that are absolutely depending on me to do the right thing. They're depending on me to treat you right, your mom right, Jesus right, money right, other people right. Because if I don't do that right, it affects everybody down there. Wow. Dave Ramsey has power, and it's not because he wants to use it wrongly. It's because his life matches his words. When Dave tells you you're doing something like an idiot, he might be right. And he's been there before, he'll tell you himself. You know one thing, number 4, this invite feedback. Have you ever thought about that? Most of the time in the church, we're so ready as a follower to want to tell everybody about how excited they should be about getting in on this. About how excited they should be that Jesus loves them. Hear me now. They should be. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I agree with you. But people authentically want to engage in that conversation. And I'm going to ask you to do this, just like Paul did. Because when Paul was done with everything, he looked at the king and said, what do you think? What are you going to do with all this, King Agrippa? And he didn't say this, we better set you down and pray right now so you can keep your own self out of hell. Could there be any truth to that? Sure. But what did he say? What do you think? And I'll tell you what happened right there is King Agrippa responded, and his response is so telling because he says, what? You think that I'm already convinced I should be a follower of Christ? Words. He was honestly thinking about it. He was impacted. He was dealing with it. So much so that he couldn't stand it. What did he do? He got up and left the room. Oh, we can do that too. But this is what you need to know, is that if you don't give the opportunity for someone to share back with you, you're not giving them the opportunity to be involved in the whole process. You're not giving them the opportunity to relate to your story, to see how it fits into their own. You're not giving them the opportunity to consider Jesus and to let Jesus do the work. Because it's not about others being just like you and I, but it is about others knowing the Jesus that we've come to know, the Jesus that maybe we've struggled through this whole process with of understanding, the Jesus who maybe impacted us just like Paul felt, where life was changed in an instant, because that happens. The Jesus that absolutely can do miraculous things all around us. People need to know that Jesus. And a part of getting to know that Jesus is allowing them to have the opportunity to go after it on their own. And oftentimes we escape that opportunity when we convince them they've got to do it like we did it. Feedback is going to give them the opportunity to get involved in that and not only experience your story, but it may be the step that they begin to experience Jesus. And I'm convinced of this. If Jesus is God, he can handle it. What is our job? Preach the gospel at all times. And when necessary, use words. Jesus can handle it. And finally, I think I'm already in trouble with children's church, right? It's all right. I only get to preach like twice a year, so I think at least I should get another hour. Finally, it's this. In this room, what I think is probably really good is if we started just going around and saying, hey, tell me about your story following Christ. I think it would be really cool because it's very likely that no one in this room is at the same spot. We're not struggling with the same things. We're not feeling victories in the same areas. We're all at a spot, but we're all relying on one thing, and that's that Jesus is going to affect our life. Jesus is going to help us. Jesus is going to direct us. So this is what I want you to think about. It's less about who you can persuade. It's less about what formulas you can use. If you like those, I think that's great. But it's more about this. Be real. There's enough fake around us every day. We don't go out into a world that gives us reality. We go out into a world that gives us fake. People need real. Tell your story and tell it confidently. Share your struggles without minimizing them. Share your victories with everything that they really mean to you and what Jesus has done in your life. Because that story is going to always be growing and always be added to. And there's always going to be people who need to hear the real story. Because when I turn on the news, anything that has anything to do with the government, I don't think it's real. Except for money's being spent. People have had enough fake. And you can give them real. Tell Jesus I know. I'm almost done. I'm so close to done right now. And all right. Don't stop creating that story, guys.